Most people think quarantine is something modern. It isn't. If you picture a Mediterranean port in the 1300s, it feels busy and alive. Ships arriving heavy with cargo, sailors calling out as they approach the dock, merchants waiting for goods that have been at sea for months. But then there's one ship that doesn't come in. It just lingers offshore. The sails are lowered, the crew waits. No one is allowed to step onto land. Families gather at the edge of the harbor, trying to recognize faces from a distance. Trade slows down. Conversations get quieter. The fear isn't dramatic. No one is screaming. It's just there, sitting in the air between the shore and that ship. What we forget is that quarantine didn't start with COVID-19 or Ebola. It began long before anyone knew what a bacterium was. It grew out of something much more basic. Fear, yes, but also the simple need to stay alive and keep food on the table. Cities depended on trade. If ships stopped coming, markets emptied, families lost income, and ships sometimes carried more than spices and silk. So how did anyone decide on 40 days? Why that number? And how did a rule made in desperation end up shaping the way modern public health still works? In 1377, in the Adriatic port city of Ragusa, what we now call Dubrovnik, local leaders were facing a problem that didn't have an obvious solution. The Black Death had swept through Europe only a few decades earlier. Entire neighborhoods had disappeared. Families were wiped out. And even after that first wave passed, outbreaks kept returning. The city couldn't simply shut its gates forever. Trade was its lifeline. But welcoming every ship without caution could mean another disaster. So the city council tried something practical. Ships arriving from places known to have disease weren't allowed to dock right away. Instead, the crews and passengers had to wait outside the city for 30 days. They called it a Trentino. It wasn't isolation in the modern hospital sense. It was simply time set aside to watch and see who became sick. Later, that waiting period stretched to 40 days, quarantino. That's where our word quarantine comes from. 40 carried religious meaning at the time. It showed up often in scripture, so it had a sense of completeness or purification. But it also happened to be long enough for many infectious diseases to show themselves. People didn't understand bacteria or viruses. Microscopes weren't part of their world yet. What they did understand from hard experience was that sickness tended to follow contact, and symptoms usually appeared within a certain stretch of time. By making travelers wait, they were unknowingly working with what we now call an incubation period, the gap between exposure and visible illness. If someone was going to fall sick, there was a good chance it would happen during those 40 days. And if they were already ill, keeping them separate reduced the chances of spreading it further. They couldn't explain why it worked, but they had seen enough to know that waiting made a difference. What began in Ragusa wasn't scientific medicine, it was a city rule, a decision made by people trying to protect their neighbors without destroying their economy. And because it seemed to help, at least more than doing nothing, the idea spread. Other ports paid attention. Other cities adopted similar measures. Venice took it even further. By 1423, the city established what's often described as one of the first formal quarantine stations on an island called Lazaretto Vecchio. Instead of just telling ships to wait offshore, Venice created a dedicated place where the sick and those suspected of illness could be separated from the rest of the population. If you imagine it, it's a cluster of stone buildings sitting on a small island in the lagoon. Not a hospital the way we think of hospitals today, but a controlled space. Guards, officials, records being kept. Ships arriving with documents declaring the health status of the ports they'd departed from. Inspectors checking crews before deciding who could enter the city and who had to remain isolated. Over time, Venice created official groups whose job was to manage outbreaks and inspect ships. Quarantine became less improvised and more organized. Long before anyone used the phrase public health system, cities were already figuring out how to handle disease together. Conditions weren't always comfortable. Sometimes they were harsh, but at least there were rules. As the centuries passed, quarantine didn't remain a Mediterranean practice. By the 1800s, it was showing up in new forms, especially during repeated cholera outbreaks in Europe and the United States. Cholera spread quickly and terrified cities. Once again, ports became points of tension. In New York, for example, quarantine stations like the Staten Island Maritime Hospital were used to detain arriving passengers suspected of carrying disease. On paper, the goal was simple: protect the city. In practice, it became more complicated. Immigrants traveling in crowded steerage conditions were far more likely to be detained than wealthier passengers. Decisions about who was risky often blended medical concerns with assumptions about class, nationality, and race. Merchants worried about delays and financial loss. Residents feared contagion spreading into their neighborhoods. Immigrant communities felt targeted and stigmatized. In 1858, local residents on Staten Island even burned parts of the quarantine hospital, convinced it was bringing danger closer to their homes. At that point, quarantine wasn't only about symptoms. It was also about who people trusted and who they didn't. It raised uncomfortable questions. Who gets confined? Who moves freely? And who gets to decide? You might think that once science advanced, quarantine would fade away, but it didn't. It just started looking different. In the late 19th century, scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch identified specific microorganisms that caused disease. Illness was no longer explained by vague ideas about bad air. It could be traced to tiny living agents that moved from person to person. That shift, what we now call germ theory, changed more than laboratory research. It changed how officials responded to outbreaks. Quarantine could now be more targeted. Instead of isolating entire ships or neighborhoods just in case, officials could focus on confirmed cases. Isolation hospitals were built specifically for infectious diseases. Contact tracing, identifying and monitoring people who had been near someone sick, became more systematic. Waiting periods could sometimes be adjusted because doctors had a clearer understanding of how long certain diseases took to develop. Instead of casting a wide net, quarantine became more precise. It wasn't just buying time out of fear, it was deliberately interrupting known chains of transmission. And still, resistance didn't disappear. During the 1918 influenza pandemic, some communities supported closures and isolation measures, while others pushed back, arguing that restrictions were excessive or economically harmful. The tension between public safety and personal freedom never fully went away. By the late 20th century and early 21st century, the world had transformed. Airplanes crossed continents in hours. Cities were tightly interconnected. Medicine had advanced in ways medieval leaders could never have imagined. We could identify viruses, sequence their genetic code, and track outbreaks in real time. And yet, when SARS appeared in 2003, health officials relied on something very old. People exposed to the virus were asked to stay home. Hospitals created isolation wards. Travel was monitored. During Ebola outbreaks, similar measures were used. And during COVID-19, on a much larger scale, separation once again became a central tool. It feels like a contradiction. We have ventilators, vaccines, antiviral medications, and complex data systems. But when a new infection appears and uncertainty is high, one of the first responses is still to reduce contact. Travel restrictions, home isolation, temporary lockdowns, not as permanent solutions, but as ways to slow transmission. The logic is simple. Infection spreads through contact. If you reduce contact, you reduce spread. In public health, this is sometimes described as breaking the chain of transmission. If you interrupt that chain long enough, you create time. Time for researchers to understand the disease, time for health systems to prepare, time for communities to adapt. When you look at all of this together, something starts to stand out. In medieval ports, it was trade weighed against safety. In the 19th century, science mixed with fear and inequality. In modern times, it's often individual freedom balanced against collective protection. Quarantine tends to surface most strongly when people don't yet have clear answers. It creates a pause, a moment for communities to catch their breath and figure out what they're dealing with. It's less about control and more about buying space to think. If you return to that ship waiting offshore in 1377, you can almost feel the stillness, people watching from a distance, unsure what will happen next. Now imagine a modern airport terminal during an outbreak or a hospital corridor under isolation protocols. The technology has changed, the language has changed, the scale is far larger, but the underlying idea is still familiar. At its core, quarantine was never meant to be punishment. It has always been about time. Time to see who becomes ill, time for science to catch up, time for communities to respond without being overwhelmed. And sometimes, when everything feels uncertain, time itself turns out to be one of the most powerful forms of protection we have.